Hello, this is that creepy bald guy, and welcome to my review of the Cinema Snob movie, the most anticipated film starring Brad Jones to come out on DVD in September of 2012. As much as I enjoyed watching the reviewers and 8-Bit Mickey get together and participate in the most epically homoerotic feature of all time,
don't go Brokeback on me.
it was the Cinema Snob movie that was really tickling my pickle. The trailer alone made me squee like a little fangirl. Squee. I mean, it's not just a comedy, but it's a comedy with elements of exploitation and giallo, which is like an Italian blend of slasher and thriller. Sweet! But what is this? Is that Jake I see in a substantial role? I am such a huge fan of Jake that I even drew a picture of him. And if you've seen my last Guidelines episode, then you should know that once MartialHorror puts pencil on paper, then only high art can be born. This is Jake going to the premiere of Smurfs 2. Notice how his frown has abandoned the confines of his face. A true representation of what shall come to pass. Although it is sad that Jared doesn't make an appearance, for those who don't know, the backstory behind that is pretty awkward. Apparently, Jared was found decapitated in a puddle of his own blood and semen, and the perpetrator was never caught. Uh-oh, me? I knew I shouldn't have drawn an exact replication of the crime scene. Oh well, time to flee to Space Mexico. Okay, I'm in Space Mexico now, so what else can we expect? We get the rest of Team Snob, among other familiar faces, Irving yoinking his doinker, and the arrival of another big reviewing personality, the Cinema Slob. Oh yeah, Spoonie's here too. But just as the Cinema Snob movie is ripe with possibilities, there is always the chance that it too will be found decapitated in a puddle of its own blood and semen. So what are some of the potential problems? As much as I enjoy the Snob's reviews, I just can't picture the character sustaining a whole movie by himself. References and cynicism can only take you so far. It is also obviously low budget, apparently being cheaper than the yearly That Got the Glasses specials, which were already pretty cheap. But most of all, unlike those features, I had to spend money on this. But don't fret, whether I watch it for free or paid $20, I will not let that get in the way of my opinions. Now I might come to your house and reenact scenes of cannibal holocaust with you, James, but it wouldn't affect my review. Yet it apparently is Lloyd approved, and that is worth 1,000 reviews. So is the movie good or bad? It's great, easily being Brad's best movie. Now I don't know if that means anything, considering I haven't seen any of his other films. Let's go ahead and move on. Brad plays Craig, a struggling screenwriter who's trying to make a blaxploitation film called Black Angus.
What's the movie about?
Okay. African-American man in the 1970s. His parents are butchered by a crooked roller derby owner, and his sister is forced into prostitution. The only way to get revenge is to be one badass, double-handed, shotgun-wielding, roller-skating, disco-dancing motherfucker with the DNA of Tony Manero, Fred Williamson, and Truck Turner combined.
But to accomplish this amazing project, he needs the backing of Dan Phillips, played by Ryan, the director of the Cinema Snob movie. Dan is a pretentious film snob who's dismissive of Craig because he looks down upon exploitation, while favoring artsploitation, aka everything Terrence Malick has ever done. When it becomes even more apparent that they need Dan, Craig and the director of Black Angus, Neil, played by I hope they make a Smurfs 3 starring Adam Sandler just so we could review it, Jake, devise a plan where Craig dons the disguise of a cinema snob. He joins Dan's film club, and from there, everything goes to hell. He's forced to participate in the analyzation of being John Malkovich, but luckily he gets a break when someone starts murdering everybody. As the cast begins to dwindle, Brad teams up with the mysterious Nancy, played by Jillian, and they must find the killer or perish. Or worse, watch the Thin Red Line in slow motion. Ugh, now that's terrifying. Well, apparently Brad shared my concern about whether the Snob could hold together a full-length feature. It can be argued that the Cinema Snob movie is a prequel to the web show, or maybe it's an alternate continuity, but it's pretty ambiguous, and you don't have to follow Brad's works in order to understand what's going on. It's set up as a standalone film and utilizes many different styles of comedy. Yes, there are in-jokes for the fans, but it's not driven by them, so what sort of comedic material do we get? God, where do I begin? Let's start with Brad, because he drives most of the jokes and is present in 98.4% of the movie. He gets a lot to do and does it masterfully. I love how sophisticated his dialogue is, but it's delivered in a way that makes it comical. He does a lot of acting with his face, which is especially hilarious when he's trying, but not totally succeeding at being a convincing film snob. It's the character's reactions that keeps everything consistently amusing. We aren't laughing at how snobbish the film club is, we laugh at Brad's fish out of water act. We might snicker when we hear in gruesome detail what the killer did to his or her victims, but the group's nonchalant attitude towards this mayhem makes it funny. Then Craig's horrified responses to both of those make these gags all the more golden. Brad, Ryan, and the crew have plenty of other funny tricks up their sleeves too. The premises and titles Craig is able to dream up are hilarious, and I love how the Black Angus concept becomes a running gag. There's a lot of side-splitting misdirection, and the dialogue was catchy and memorable. The filmmakers always found ways to make me laugh, and the jokes never became stale. They do occasionally poke fun at how absurd the situation is, or will toy with meta-humor, but not to the extent where it starts to knock down the fourth wall. Don't get me wrong, this is a silly movie, but it never becomes too far-fetched. There are a fair amount of references in typical Brad fashion, but it's just treated as a character quirk and nothing more. Now you may have noticed that I haven't been showing many clips, well, besides the voiceover stuff. This is because, whereas To Boldly Flee is very rapid-fire with its comedy, the Cinema Snob movie relies much more on context. Doug Walker's films just set up the joke, then give a payoff in the same scene. But to understand the jokes here, you'd likely need to know the preceding scene, and I don't want to show that much. But the less lazy reason I don't show many examples is there is a certain unpredictability to the humor, and I don't want to ruin any surprises. The writing also provides some sweet and thoughtful moments, such as when Craig says you shouldn't put too much faith in the critics' opinions unless they're named MartialHorror. At least that's how I interpreted that scene. And once again, Brad does incredibly well in these more dramatic sequences. There's only one more thing I want to say about his acting. We can actually see how stressed out Craig is becoming as the situation becomes more dangerous, and that is very difficult to pull off. If this is not Brad's best performance, then it's at least his, fullest performance, considering all of the material he gets to work with. The direction, on the other hand, isn't as easy to describe. It can be summed up as very point and shoot, which ironically is the complete opposite of how Giallos were directed. But at the same time, that is how exploitation filmmakers worked. Giallos are usually flashy and experimental when it came to camera work and lighting, but I'm glad they didn't go that route because it might have been too distracting. It is still a comedy, and that kind of over-stylized direction probably would have diminished the impact of the jokes. Ryan does seem to be having fun with the lighting though. Notice how the lighting becomes dimmer as the story gets darker. It's actually fairly moody. Now the thriller angle doesn't really come into play until around the 50-minute mark. The stock scenes aren't very suspenseful, but the payoffs are pretty cool. I expected the kills to be average, like the one we see in the trailer, which is the first death, but as the bodies start to pile, the makeup effects become more ambitious, and I was surprised at how grisly the on-screen attacks were. There's also nudity, which I really wasn't expecting. So props to the crew for going all out with the exploitation elements. It made the experience that much more impressive. The tension becomes edgier as we get closer and closer to the finale, but it never betrays the comedic tone of the first half. It's always a comedy, it's just darker than it was before. There's nothing especially shocking about the twist ending. In fact, I'd be surprised if you don't figure out who the killer is. I thought it was Lord Cat, which in retrospect was a pretty bad choice on my part considering he's not even in the movie. But that just makes it a little less like Deep Red and a little more like Blood and Blacklace, where it's not the reveal that matters, it's what led up to it. So I liked how it was written and directed. Let's move on to the supporting cast. While Brad might get the best moments, everyone has their time to shine. Well, that's all I have to say about the supporting cast. Let's discuss the next topic. I'm presuming since it's not cutting away that I have to go a little bit deeper than that. Damn. Gillian surprised me because this is the type of character that's usually the weakest link in any kind of thriller. She isn't written like she's the tacked-on love interest, but instead has her own personality, and moves the story along more than Craig does. Gillian has a lot of charisma and is fun to watch. The love story works because they have chemistry and the romance isn't, well, Twilight-ish. I'm not going to get shot for saying that, am I? Good job. Spoonie doesn't have a very big role. In fact, it's just an extended cameo, but his performance freaked me the out. When I think of Spoonie, I think of his hammy facial expressions and over-the-top gestures. But here he comes across as a normal person. And I refuse to believe that Spoonie isn't as insane as he makes himself out to be on his Twitter account. I shouldn't even be calling him Spoonie here, though. This is Noah playing an independent character, so great job. Irving shows up to pump his douchebag. Using my amazing critiquing skills, I have deduced that that scene is a metaphor for masturbation. Ryan's delivery is pretty stiff. Maybe Irving should have stroked him. But it works for the character, and there are a few exceptional moments where he's just perfect. I like how the movie isn't unfair to these kinds of film snobs. It just acknowledges them as being the other side of the same coin, and their contempt for exploitation isn't any different than Craig's contempt for art house. The message seems to be we have different tastes, but that's okay as long as we hate those chipmunks. Speaking of whom, the award for Best Performance by someone named Jake to appear in a Cinema Snob movie that is being reviewed by MartialHorror goes to Sarah! Well, okay, so much for that lead-in. What about Jake? He seems awfully happy, and considering I presume he spends every moment of his life scowling, remembering every bad movie that Brad has forced him to sit through, I can safely say that this is the best performance in anything ever made since the dawn of man. It should be noted that most of these actors aren't really actors. They're Brad's friends, so expect some off moments. But I thought everyone had something to bring to the table. And by table I of course mean film, because clearly the Cinema Snob movie is symbolic for tables. So the cast and crew all deserve a big pat on the back. Side. I had to slip in some creepiness because God forbid this become a normal review. So any criticisms? Well, the most prominent complaint is the running time. It can be argued that there are plenty of unnecessary characters or subplots, but I personally disagree because I found all of those subplots and characters to be very entertaining. So while it might bother you, it did not bug me. I did feel that the score was underwhelming. The first time I watched this, the only tune that really stood out was this transition jingle.
This is a really shitty green screen, Neil.
And I only noticed that because they play it a lot. Upon subsequent viewings, I made a point to pay more attention, and the score in itself began to grow on me. It just doesn't stand out very much during the film. Don't get me wrong, it's still decent, but in my opinion, Skitch did better work on the Back Out the Glasses anniversaries. I probably wouldn't buy the soundtrack, but I would definitely illegally download it. But now we've come to my biggest problem with this Cinema Snob movie, the audio. My hearing isn't very good to begin with, so this will probably affect me more than it does you. It went like this. I'd struggle understanding what was being said, so I'd crank up the volume. This temporarily worked, but then it would suddenly become really loud, so I'd lower it and the process would repeat itself. It was a constant battle with my remote, which ended in violence. And it turns out that a ninja was moonlighting as my remote, so I ended up getting my ass kicked. However, this wasn't as much of a problem when I watched it on my computer with headphones. It was only distracting when I viewed it on my television. But really, these are all trifles. I was totally into the movie. The jokes worked the majority of the time, the story was clever, and the characters were fun. It delivered laughs, violence, nudity, and Irving doinking his worm, all of which happen to be the 4 traits I look for in quality films. I'd rate it an 8.8931572864.5 out of 10. So obviously I would recommend it, but is it worth buying? Yes, I think it's pretty obvious where that was leading to. If you'd like a link provided so you can buy it, please check the description below. My name is MartialHorror, and I'm here to tell you that those who cannot do, critique. I was considering pointing out some of the continuity errors, but my facial hair called me a douchebag and said I had no right. I don't really know what that means, but my facial hair isn't very nice to me.